Sok szeretettel köszöntök mindenkit, ez a 21. század intézet Mozgásban című műsorának novemberi adása. A mai témánk pedig Kína lesz, ami sokak számára titokzatos, ismeretlen, nem nagyon ismerjük azt, hogy mi zajlik pontosan Kínában. Magyarországon is nagyon kevés olyan szakember van, aki mélyrehatólag ismerné a kínai folyamatokat, ezért most mi is egy külföldi szakembert kértünk meg arra, hogy beszéljen nekünk arról, hogy mi a helyzet Kínával, mi a helyzet az Amerikai Egyesült Államok és Kína között zajló konfliktusról, mi a geopolitikai helyzet jelenleg. Egy előre rögzített beszélgetést fognak látni David Goldmannel, ellenzővel, közgazdásszal, az Asia Times-tól. Nagyon szépen köszönjük neki, hogy elfogadta a meghívásunkat.
Well, China is in some ways a much greater challenge to the United States, in some ways a much lesser challenge. As you say, the Russians had a messianic ambition to extend their system to every part of the world. They funded communist parties to subvert Western Europe and to the extent they could, the United States and elsewhere. They funded third world insurgencies, and of course they occupied the countries of Eastern Europe. Which was a tragic and horrible experience. The Chinese have no such ambition. They don't attempt to export their system. In fact, the Chinese don't think we barbarians are capable of governing ourselves according to the Chinese system. They are not curious about how to govern themselves. But because their economic and technological power is so great, and in fact is growing, Chinese influence around the world may be far greater than anything the Russians could have dreamed of. And that does constitute a major challenge to the United States in a number of ways, not just to our military and technological superiority, but also to the international order based on the dollar reserve currency, which is fundamental to American power. Among other things, it's allowed America to live beyond its means and accumulate a government debt that's now larger than our GDP, and to run a budget deficit roughly 10% of GDP and enormous current account deficit. If we had to adjust, we live within our means because the dollar reserve currency system were replaced. That would be a shocking and painful adjustment for the United States. Well, I think these are quite different things. Taiwan is an existential issue for the Chinese state. Remember that China is not a nation state. It's a multi-ethnic and multilingual empire. It has 6 major language groups, 80 languages, 200 dialects. It is a collection of different peoples held together by a centralized bureaucracy and centralized infrastructure, and it has been for thousands of years. And certainly since the Qin dynasty unified China in the 3rd century of BCE. So from China's standpoint, a rebel province like Taiwan is a threat to its integrity and a possible precedent for other rebel provinces. That's why China is so sensitive on the issue, and why, in fact, if the West tries to promote a Taiwanese secession, independence, China will go to war. The issue with the Uyghurs is a pragmatic matter. China has been conducting punitive campaigns against what it calls unruly barbarians for thousands of years. And the Chinese approach is very much like Don Corleone in The Godfather. Keep your enemies close, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So they will cooperate with Turkey, for example, which is the ethnic cousin of the Uyghurs, and bribe the Turks in order to secure their cooperation in keeping the Uyghurs quiet in Xinjiang province. That's more of a practical matter. The Japanese island issues are relatively minor issues. The Chinese will assert territorial disputes, but they don't have the existential character that the Taiwan issue does. The disorderly and humiliating withdrawal of America from Afghanistan reduced our credibility in all respects. And of course, that bothers the Taiwanese because it makes their principal friend, the United States, I wouldn't say ally because formally we're not an ally because we're not formally a country, the principal friend look weaker. But there's a broader problem with Afghanistan. The United States was the guarantor of security in the Middle East and Central Asia for the last 2 decades. Now the United States has effectively abandoned Central Asia and is showing less interest in the Middle East. China and Russia have large and restive Muslim populations, and with the United States exiting, they have to take responsibility for geopolitics in a vast part of the world, which the United States previously took responsibility for. So this pushes Russia and China to collaborate strategically and militarily, despite their considerable differences and their competition over influence in Central Asia. And in my view, the most important effect of the Afghanistan withdrawal was to force the Chinese and Russians into a de facto alliance to pick up the pieces that we left behind us. And that is a considerable loss of American. I think we should fear it. Richard Nixon, in his wisdom, went to China in 1972 to try to split China and Russia, and it's certainly the case that Nixon's approach to China was an important factor in America's victory in the Cold War. It certainly covered America's flank when we withdrew from Vietnam. The Russians and Chinese don't like each other, never have. And there are many Western analysts who wonder why we haven't tried to do more to bring Putin to the Western side as opposed to push him into a Eurasian strategy. I share that view. The most important thing the Russians and Chinese are doing is technological collaboration. So, for example, the United States has made great efforts to keep Chinese telecom technology and their national champion Huawei out of Western countries. But Huawei is in fact building all of Russia's 5G capacity. Huawei has the largest research facility outside China in Russia. Russia is a weak economy, but it is a technological powerhouse. In absolute terms, Russia graduates as many engineers each year as the United States do, and they're extremely good. Russian weapons technology is first rate, in some cases better than American weapons technology. And the union of Russian brain and Chinese industrial power is something that will surely give China a considerable advantage towards the West. So in my view, we've been really stupid to push the Russians into the arms of China through sanctions and various other things. Well, that's what we're trying to figure out at the moment. I think that the Biden administration isn't quite sure what to do. The most important fact about Trump's policy towards China is that it failed. Trump imposed a 25% tariff on American imports from China. That was supposed to correct the American trade deficit with China. In fact, that trade deficit has grown enormously. It's now $600 billion a year. That's something like, that's several times Hungary's GDP. And it represents 30% of our manufacturing domestic product. So given that this has failed, there are several things we can do. Our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has pointed out that this is now a significant factor in our inflation. And inflation is now the biggest problem in the U.S. economy and possibly the biggest problem for the Democratic Party and for the possible reelection of a Democratic Congress and president. So there's certainly a view in the administration expressed by people like Yellen that we should abandon the Trump policy, reduce the tariffs, or even eliminate them because it would help us economically. On the other hand, we have a problem of what the Chinese call face, of credibility, with respect to Taiwan. The Chinese act like bullies, sound like bullies. It's a bullying culture. And if the United States is perceived to be weak in face of Chinese threats against Taiwan, our credibility is gone. So I think the Biden administration wants to walk a very fine line of maintaining its credibility and supporting democracy of Taiwan without, however, triggering any of the tripwires which might lead to a tragic outcome in East Asia. That's how war started. That's how World War I began, and that kind of war would have no winner. So I believe that the great majority of key people in the Biden administration wish to avoid such an outcome. So that's more a matter of walking a fine line between credibility towards Taiwan and war avoidance with China. Well, I think the United States would very much like to have some kind of alliance against China, but I'm far less convinced than some people in the administration that this will be effective. In the case of Australia, it'll take them 15 years to get these new boats into the water, and a nuclear submarine without nuclear weapons is like an AK-47 loaded with chewing gum. What are they going to do with it? Shoot it with cruise missiles? It's simply not a contributor to the strategic situation. Japanese have to decide which way they want to go. The Japanese surely do not want a war with China. Would they sacrifice Japanese cities to defend Taiwan? I'm doubtful about that. The Indians are very far away from the South China Sea. It's very easy for them to talk to the United States about participating in the Quad and respective alliances, and at the same time buy most of their weapons from Russia and quietly negotiate with the Chinese. I don't think the Indians want to do anything but what they've always done, which is maintain a course amongst the great powers and pursue their own interests. So I'm doubtful that the Quad is going to be a critical development. The most important fact about China is that they're building many hundreds of missiles which can sink American ships. And those are very effective at relatively close distance to their coast. It's certainly true that Chinese do not care how the barbarians govern themselves. They don't care about human rights issues. They have no ambitions to export their system. But when they move into countries in the global south, they move in with enormous depth. I wrote a book about this called China's Plan to Sino-form the World. In other words, make the world like China. And I personally saw this with an investment banker. I introduced Huawei to Mexico in 2015. The Chinese are now building broadband networks in many countries: Indonesia, Africa, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Panama. And when they come in and build a broadband network, they also bring in e-commerce, e-finance, the whole apparatus of the Chinese ecosystem, and implant themselves in these economies. Now, this certainly does bring about benefits. In the case of Mexico, Huawei built a national broadband system and reduced the cost of broadband by about 75%. So, as one example, when I was in Mexico introducing the Huawei people in 2015, the taxi drivers didn't use GPS positioning systems like Waze because broadband was too expensive. They didn't have broadbands on their cell phone. Now they all do. And Waze has its #2 market in the world in Mexico City. So certainly the Chinese have brought benefits, but it also gives them enormous control and influence. And that's something which the United States is quite worried about. Well, I think the Chinese are communist in the same way that the Italian mafia is Catholic. They take it very seriously, but the practical importance is sometimes limited. China has governed itself more or less the same way for thousands of years. This is a country that's ethnically and linguistically and geographically diverse, but is held together by massive river systems. And that's in turn required a centralized bureaucracy and a centralized tax system. So China has always been run by a centralized bureaucracy that cherry picks the most talented individuals in the provinces and brings them to the center as the unifying factor in the country. Whether you call this communist or mandarin, it pretty much works the same way. Now, Mao Zedong was a real communist. The Great Leap Forward was a communist program. It killed 30 or 40 million people. But when Deng Xiaoping introduces reforms in 1979, I view this as a reversion to China's historical model, which has been in place for a very, very long time. Chinese bureaucrats were selected by standardized exams more than 2,000 years ago. And that system was perfected in the Tang dynasty in the 8th century, before the Magyars came to Hungary. China's system is inherently unstable because it's so ethnically and linguistically diverse. Imagine if some Holy Roman Emperor, say Maximilian of Habsburg in the 15th century, had succeeded in unifying all of Europe under an absolute monarchy. Well, think of the Austro-Hungarian Empire with its many different nationalities and its centralized state and bureaucracy. That's an inherently unstable arrangement. Now, of course, China does not have the problems that Austro-Hungary did, which is, for example, a Russia that was encouraging Serbian independence. So it's not quite as unstable as Austro-Hungary was. But unless China can successfully continue raising the living standards of its people, they will be in danger of instability. That's something the Communist Party is deeply aware of. And the Communist Party really has bet its future on what it calls the Fourth Industrial Revolution. That's the mass application of artificial intelligence towards productivity enhancing technologies in industry, agriculture, logistics, transportation, and so forth. And what they're doing is quite impressive. Whether they'll succeed or not, we don't know. But the effort they're making is really the most interesting thing happening in the world today. Well, personally, his goal is pretty clear. He managed to get an unprecedented third term as party chairman and president of China. He wants to be the great man who brings China into the modern era. China's objective is to have a population of 1.4 billion people with the same standard of living as Western Europe and the United States by about the middle of this century or shortly afterwards. The goal they've stated. And to give you an idea of where they are now, China really is two countries. In the more advanced cities in China, like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, you have about 350 million people who are earning a per capita GDP of about $30,000 a year. That's about half the American level, but it's not a tenth of the American level. And in purchasing power parity terms, it's even more. So the way China sees it, and the way they think about it, is we have a core of about 350 million people who are an advanced nation already inside China, and we want to extend that to all of China. And of course, if China has GDP per capita comparable to the West, for over 1 billion people, they will be by far the most powerful country in the world. And that's what they want. The Chinese Communist Party under Mao as a peasant rebellion was a classic Chinese phenomenon. Chinese dynasties have been overthrown again and again by peasant uprisings against the center. These are motivated by economic circumstances, geographic disasters, foreign invasions, and so forth. And Mao, in a sense, was a classic bandit rebel with a peasant background. The Chinese Communist Party today is 93 million people. It's it's larger than the population of the adult population of France or Germany. So it's much more a recreation of the old Mandarin bureaucracy and the leadership of civil society. It's become very different. Chinese dynasties have absorbed peasant rebels in the past. You get a rebel coming in, and then he finds there's only one way to run China, and that's the way it's always been run, and he's absorbed into the traditional Chinese model. So I view the Chinese discussions of the history of the Communist Party as a kind of salvation history of saints, which has a quasi-religious function, but not particularly practical. The people who are running policy now are much more likely to have doctorates from American universities and experience on Wall Street. Yes, I think it's a definite risk, because if the United States decides to preempt China's ability to take over Taiwan, let's say that we mine the Straits of Taiwan or introduce weapons which would make it impossible for a Chinese landing to occur, the Chinese very likely will preempt that and invade Taiwan. I don't believe the Chinese will invade if the status quo is maintained, but if we try to attempt to change the status quo in our favor, then the Chinese will respond. And if there is a military engagement, I think with very high probability, the Chinese will sink some American ships, perhaps sink an American fleet aircraft carrier. That hasn't happened since the Battle of Midway, 80 years ago. So in that case, we're left, if some of our ships are sunk, we're left with a choice of doing nothing and being humiliated, or a nuclear exchange. There's an excellent book by Admiral James Stavridis. He was formerly the head of America's Pacific Command, very competent soldier. It's called 2034. It presents just such a scenario for a war with China. I think that would be a tragic result. Like World War I, there would be no winners, and we should do our best to avoid that. I'm all for massive defense spending for defensive weapons and high technology, but I think we've already lost the war in the South China Sea, and we shouldn't try to fight.
Köszönjük David Goldmannek, hogy elfogadta a felkérésünket, és hogy egy ilyen mélyreható elemzést, körképet adott nekünk az aktuális kínai és különféle geopolitikai eseményekről. Decemberben jelentkezünk újabb Mozgásban adással, viszontlátásra!